Hi, I'm Tom Miggott from Tom Miggott Photography. Over the past 10 episodes we covered the real basics of photography. We saw the components of the exposure triangle, the ISO, the shutter and the aperture. We saw how closely they work with each other and even compensate each other. We even touched base on some creative aspect of the aperture and the shutter. Today I want to cover the exposure modes your camera offers you. So to do so, I have with me a DSLR. This is a Canon 20D. It's an older version than my own Canon 60D that I'm currently using to shoot this episode with. So all the features that I'm going to be covering today can be found on any digital camera out there on the market, whether it's a point and shoot or a DSLR. There are a variety of exposure modes on digital cameras nowadays. However, you could regroup them in two categories. The first one being the basics and the second one being the creatives. So let's have a look at the basics. The very first one would be the full automatic mode, and this can be found on your camera. It's usually a green rectangle or green square, and when you set the dial to that setting, basically what you're doing is you're saying to your camera, choose everything for me. And it's going to do so. It's going to choose the ISO, it's going to choose the aperture, it's going to choose the shutter speed, it's even going to choose whether or not you need a flash for that scene, and it's going to take the shot for you. And then only then, the only thing you have to say is whether or not you like that shot, but it's probably too late for you to choose. So this is the full automatic one. Suffice to say that I don't recommend you to use that one, and no serious photographer out there would actually use that. The second mode is going to be a head of a person icon, and when you set this on your camera, you're basically informing your camera that you're going to shoot a portrait. So let's think for a second what your camera is going to do with this. As we saw in the video on the creative aspect of the aperture, we saw how important the depth of field is when it comes to portrait photography, because you can blur the background and really focus on your subject. Well, the camera knows as much as you do now, and all it's going to do is probably get the widest aperture that it can get. The shutter speed, to compensate for the light, is probably going to increase the shutter speed, and God knows what's going to happen with the ISO. So once again, on this mode you have nothing to say. You only made your choice. You just inform your camera, okay, take the shot for me, do it for me, just one thing, I'm shooting a portrait. That's all it is. That's all it is to it. Then the next mode represents kind of a mountain and a cloud, and that is for landscape photography. So once again, when we talked about the depth of field, we saw that a narrow depth of field is interesting for portrait because it blurs the backgrounds out. But for landscape photography, where the depth of field needs to be as wide, as deep as it can, you're going to need a very narrow aperture. So in that mode, what your camera is going to do is going to go for the narrowest aperture you can get on your camera. Then because of that, it's going to slow down the shutter speed to make sure that it's not underexposed, and then God knows what's going to happen with the ISO as well. So with this mode, you don't have anything to say for that matter. You only told your camera, hey, I want to shoot landscape photography, shoot landscape photography. Don't ask me any question, I don't know anything, I'm stupid. You're the camera, you're the best. So that's this mode. Then another mode would be macro photography, and it's represented by a flower icon. So what it does here, just like for the portrait and landscape, is going to take all the power. You only told the camera that you wanted macro photography. So we will see macro photography in future episodes, but what I can tell you already is it's going to go for the narrowest aperture as possible. That's what it needs for macro photography. It's probably going to bring the ISO up and increase the shutter speed, because you want a very quick shutter speed. So that's for this mode. Then the next one, I have a logo of somebody running, and that would be kind of sport photography. And we understand by this that the shutter is going to be playing a big role on this. However, you can't set up anything. You only told the camera, I want to do sport photography, and the camera is going to do the rest for you. The ISO, the aperture, the shutter is going to choose that for you. Because guess what? Well, as far as Canon, Nikon and Pentax and Sony and the others, when you choose that mode, you're not as intelligent as the camera. Well, are you? Well, I don't think it's true, you know. As far as I'm concerned, I am, and I'm pretty sure you are more intelligent than the camera. The camera is just a tool. It doesn't know what you want. It doesn't know what you think. So what can we do? Well, guess what? We move to the creative modes. So let's move to the creative category. I didn't even bother telling you about another mode which represents a flash symbol with a cross. So basically all that would be is a full automatic mode. You tell the camera, okay, take that shot for me. Take that shot for me, but please don't fire the flash. So that's what that mode is. Totally ridiculous. Maybe useful when you go to the museum and you really don't want to use the flash, and if you were on full automatic, well, the flash would pop up, and you don't want that. So let's go back to the more interesting modes, the most interesting category, and that is the creative category. The very first mode in that creative category is the P mode. It stands for program, and it's basically like the full automatic one. So the camera decides everything, but before you take the shot, before you press that button, you still have the chance to change the shutter speed and the aperture and the ISO, and that kind of change depending on the camera. Sometimes it only lets you change the ISO. So that's the very first one where you at least can interfere with the camera's decision. Next one that I want to talk to you about is the mode AV on Canon. Just one side note here. The terms used in the Canon world may change depending whether you use a Lumix or if you use Sony or Nikon. Everything on my blog for this particular episode will be covered, so I will try my best to translate in the most popular cameras so you guys are not being confused if you don't think that your camera has that feature, but in fact has it just under a different name. So everything will be on my blog, and I'm pretty sure you know the address by now, but here it is just in case. What? Okay, so the mode I want to talk to you about is AV. AV stands for aperture value, and this is the fantastic mode. It's the aperture priority mode. I've used that mode when we did the episodes on the creative aperture. So basically what you do when you deal with those core those creative modes, the ISO is set up with a different button. It's on the side. On the Canon 20D, for example, it's right here, quite similar to the 60D for that matter. So you set up your ISO, and then because you're on the aperture priority mode, you set up your aperture, and the camera is only going to choose the appropriate or the most appropriate shutter speed matching your aperture value. So here I set up my ISO because I'm inside and it's an old camera. I'm setting it up to 800, and then I decide my aperture value. So I decide 4.5 and I press just to do the metering, and the camera says, well, you need a shutter speed of 1/15 of a second. So that the camera chose the shutter speed. So that mode is the favorite one for most serious photographers out there, simply because when you shoot photography, you tend to know at the moment where you shoot, you tend to know whether the background is important to your exposure or not. And as we saw, if it's portrait, your background might not be that important and you want a narrow depth of field. If you're shooting landscape, then you want to make sure that your aperture value is going to be pretty big, but your aperture is going to be pretty small. Your aperture value, pretty big values such as f/15, f/22, f/32, and then the camera will choose the shutter speed adequately. So that's why this aperture priority mode is really one of the favorite one. Then another semi-automatic in the way, but still part of the creative mode, it's the TV mode on the camera, nothing to do with television. TV stands for time value. I know on Nikon and Sony and the other, you may find an S letter instead, standing for shutter. And this is the shutter priority mode. I've used that mode when I did the creative aspect of the shutter because I wanted a specific shutter speed, which was 250th of a second, and then my aperture was chosen by the camera right after that, since I've given the shutter speed and the ISO. So that shutter speed priority mode is really good when you know that you want to shoot something either moving, or you want to bring some motion into your picture, or you want to freeze a moment and you know that you need to have a specific shutter speed value. So you set this up, you set up your ISO, and the camera is going to choose your aperture value that's going to give you a correct exposure, a well-balanced exposure. So this is the third mode. The final mode is the M mode, standing for manual, and basically in that mode it's the total opposite of the full automatic mode. In that mode you choose everything. You choose the ISO, you choose the aperture, you choose the shutter speed. Note that with the aperture priority mode and the shutter speed priority mode, you can still change either the shutter speed value or the aperture value that the camera gives you once you've chosen the other one. You can still do it using the exposure compensation tool in your camera, and we'll do that in another episodes. But with the manual one, the process is a bit more, I'd say, not complicated, because it's very simple. I'm going to show you in a minute why it's not complicated at all. It just takes more time, because if you're shooting out there and you know your aperture value, you know that you're shooting a portrait and you want to be at f2.8, then you set it up to f2.8, but then you need to move your dial to change the shutter speed and look through the viewfinder or the LCD screen to see whether or not the camera is showing whether the result will be a correct exposure or not. So it's a bit time consuming. However, who uses the manual mode? Many photographers use it because they have really a lot of experience. They've been shooting for years, 10, 20, 30 years and so on. And they know when they see a situation, they can assess the situation, and they know based on the experience what the shutter speed and the aperture value should be. So they do that in manual because they know it pretty much by heart. And then if it's not correct, then it just play with it. But that's what they're used to. Also, having 30 years of experience and more, there's big chances that they've used a film camera for many years, and therefore at that time everything was manual, so that's what they're used to it. I use the manual mode when I start from the aperture mode and I see that I'm not quite satisfied with the exposure at the end. It's either overexposed or underexposed, and rather than playing with the exposure compensation, which is going to play with the opposite factor, so if I'm on the aperture value, it's going to play with the shutter speed. If I'm on the shutter priority mode, then it's going to change the aperture value. Rather than using that tool, that feature, then I move to the manual mode and I use the same setting and then play with it. So let's do a quick test here. I'm starting on the aperture value. I'm going to be taking a picture. I have a guitar right there in the corner, and I'm going to be taking a picture of that guitar. So I remove my glasses and remove obviously the cap. Be useful. I'm going to be on ISO 800 because it's inside a 10-old camera. I'm going to zoom a little bit. It's an 1855 millimeter. It's the kit lens, so I don't have a lot of zoom lens here. So I'm just going to zoom on the head of the guitar, and I'm at 5.6, and it tells me that the shutter speed is going 1/60th of a second. So okay, I take that shot and I look at it, well, it's all right, but I'm not gonna, that's not the point of what I'm trying to make here. So I was at 5.6 and I was at 1/60th of a second at 800 ISO, sorry. So keeping that in mind, now I change the mode and I'm going to manual. And I set up my ISO 800. My aperture is still at 5.6, and now, without even looking, pressing anything, I'm just going to change the shutter speed. So I'm setting up to 1/60th of a second, which is what it found just before. So I'm focusing again, and I take the shot. I actually took two, and I'm looking at it, and well, there is no difference. The two images I shot, basically, whether I was on aperture priority mode or manual mode, they're identical when it comes to exposure, simply because they are using the same settings. So you see, we've just taken a manual exposure. That's no more complicated than that. And then if I was not happy with this, then I can just change the shutter speed or change the aperture value. So this is the manual mode. I cannot encourage you enough to discard any basic mode. The full automatic, the scenes like the portrait, landscape, sport, and the other features that your camera can come up with. Really, don't use them. Use the core mode. Use the creative mode, and even start with a P mode if you're not if you're just beginning. You start with a P mode. Your camera is gonna assess the situation, making choices for you. It's gonna choose the shutter speed, the ISO, the aperture, but then it's still gonna enable you to change that before you actually press to make the shot. So you can play with that if you don't feel yet comfortable. However, you know, we've covered the aperture, we've covered the shutter, we covered the ISO. Now you have the tool, you have the knowledge to do exactly what the camera does, and even better, because you can choose what you want. When in a portrait photography, the camera is going to choose the widest aperture you can get. Maybe you don't want the widest aperture. Maybe you just want a wide aperture, but not the widest. Well, you can do that with a creative mode. You are the one responsible for your exposure. You're God. And discard the other one, because, you know, once again, you're not less intelligent or smarter than your camera. You are smarter than your camera. Alright guys, there's one more thing I wanted to talk to you today about, and this is a new email address that I've set up just for you. Use this email address to send your questions, your comments, or even topics you want me to cover in future episodes. The address is written right here. It's asktmp@gmail.com. TMP for Tom Migot Photography. And I promise I'll do my best to reply to all your emails and to make sure that I cover what you're really interested in future episodes. And until then, this is Tom Migot saying, if you like it, well, capture it.